Decisions and deniability. It seems fair to say that the extent of the military effort called for in the CIA's Cuban Expeditionary Force landing and lodgment plan in Cuba was both a shock and a surprise to the new Kennedy administration, especially since the CIA was moving towards executing the operation within a matter of weeks at the start of the administration. While some authors have written that Kennedy had himself been briefed in detail on the operations and landings even prior to the November election, there is no historical record to substantiate that premise. In fact, the concept of the amphibious operation had only begun to develop within the Cuba Project team in late November, first being presented at an overview level to the Eisenhower Special Group in December 1960. President Kennedy did not participate in the first actual overview of the project until a meeting with the CIA on January 28, 1961. And in December 1960, the CIA actually had no force in readiness to support its new proposal. The Cuban volunteers in Guatemala, some 500 of them, were in the first stages of being switched from preparation as guerrilla fighters to conventional infantry training. Yet by January, hundreds more were being recruited and trained for a beach landing. And before the first briefings of the new Kennedy administration, the military element of the project was making a transition to full combat infantry actions. This would involve heavy weapons, tanks, and paratroop drops, as well as airstrikes to eliminate the Cuban Air Force and provide combat air support for the proposed landing. What happened to the Cuba project during December-January can only be described as major mission creep, a shift in objective from covertly supporting an indigenous guerrilla campaign to landing a conventional military force in an operation which could itself trigger a broad insurgency against the Castro regime. By definition, mission creep results in an unplanned commitment. However, in this instance, something even more dangerous happened. A major change in a covert project without a specific commitment from President Eisenhower or any new directive or budget to authorize the change. Perhaps most dangerously, the mission creep occurred during a transition in political administrations, a transition which involved the replacement of virtually all the national security and special group figures involved in decision-making and oversight of the initial project, which had been approved by President Eisenhower almost a year earlier. As noted earlier, following the November election, White House 4 Operations Chief of the Cuba Project, Jake Easterline, had attempted to convince Richard Bissell that project activities should go on hold until discussions could occur with the incoming Kennedy administration. That attempt was totally rebuffed by Bissell. It appears that instead, based strictly on verbal encouragement from the Eisenhower Special Group, plus a much more general push for some sort of action from President Eisenhower himself, Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell had begun to shift to a landings operation well before introducing it to President Kennedy or the incoming administration. That shift provides us with considerable insight into just how mission creep occurs, even with the special group engaged and with some level of project oversight. It seems to have begun in a special group meeting of December 3, 1960, a meeting which involved considerable dialogue about the increasing challenge posed by Castro's rapidly growing military and security forces. Concerns caused some participants to propose a substantial expansion of the proposed volunteer infantry force, perhaps doubling it to 3,000 fighters. In response, but with no special request from the group, on December 8, Bissell brought the project's new military chief to a special group meeting to present the new landing and lodgment proposal, which included a series of preliminary airstrikes. The group responded positively, approving American military trainers and calling for contingent studies for actual American military support. Based on that reception, during December and early January, Bissell moved ahead with a number of major operational activities, including recruiting, diplomatic negotiation, construction projects, and the acquisition of aircraft, weapons, and naval vessels. Effectively, the special group endorsement was being used as an authorization to initiate activities and acquisitions, all well beyond the scope of the original project, which President Eisenhower had authorized, and beyond its official project directive, its original budget, and the initial operations plan. Details of the new military proposal were not briefed directly to President Eisenhower, possibly based on the advice Dulles had given to the special group in the earliest days of the project months earlier. In a meeting on January 2nd, 1962, following Castro's demand that the U.S. reduce its embassy staff in Havana, President Eisenhower had reviewed the Cuban situation and pushed the CIA for more creative and prompter action. He even raised the idea of a provocation incident to justify American military action. While specifics of the new landing lodgment proposal were apparently not presented in the January 2nd meeting, at least for the record, Dulles touted the exile army in training, while at the same time maintaining that it could not be ready for action prior to March. Dulles also introduced the need for new training locations for the additional troops, and Secretary of Defense Thomas Gates wanted to decentralize trainees throughout American bases. President Eisenhower reportedly raised no objection, and another indication that certain of the restrictions imposed on the original plan were no longer in play, at least as of the last month of the Eisenhower administration. On another point, President Eisenhower directed that the Cuban volunteers be immediately equipped with recoilless rifles and commented that it would be important to mobilize a stronger invasion force so that failure in the first effort would not wipe out the whole project. There were also remarks indicating that American military support was going to be required for the force being trained. It's worth noting that Dulles' statement on January 2nd that the force could not be prepared and ready until sometime in March is not at all consistent with the internal CIA messaging that was going on between its military leader, Hawkins, in communications to Easterline. That had been sent only 2 days later. That was sent only 2 days later on January 4th. In that message, Hawkins, as military chief of the volunteer force, warned that the insertion of the force had to occur prior to March 1. Otherwise, the rapid advances in Cuban military capability would likely overwhelm it. While not critical in itself, this inconsistency raises the issue that the project's best informed military leaders were often not included in strategic discussions, a problem which became increasingly serious in the following months. During the following weeks, the Eisenhower Special Group continued to meet on Cuba. On January 5th, all parties in the meeting agreed that the overt involvement of American forces should be considered. And in a follow-on meeting on January 12th, there was a proposal that for contingency plans for overt use of American military force be prepared. The theme was reinforced again in meetings of January 19th. A review of the special group meetings of January 1961 clearly shows that the Eisenhower administration, if not personally the president, was clearly open to the direct use of American military in support of the CIA's landing and lodgment plans. Given the encouragement coming from the special group, CIA officers from the headquarters were dispatched to Nicaragua to begin negotiations related to establishing a site for a strike base in that country. The base would be necessary to sustain combat air missions against Cuba, and Nicaragua would also be important in actually launching the ships and equipment of the amphibious force. There is simply no doubt that the CIA and the Cuban project team were aggressively proceeding with the landing and lodgment operation even before their first meeting with senior staff from the new Kennedy administration, which occurred only on January 22nd, 1961. The new Secretary of State, Dean Russ, chaired that first meeting and began by asking for a military review of the situation. Joint Chiefs Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer described Cuba as an armed camp. The Cuban Army had 32,000 men, the militia over 200,000, the National Police some 9,000. Over 30,000 tons of arms and equipment had been received on the previous few months. And in turn, the CIA director described the Cuba Project's propaganda, political action, and military efforts to date. He estimated the active resistance inside Cuba as only involving some 1,000 men in scattered groups, and Dulles characterized the current CIA program military status in terms of some 500 to 600 volunteers who were being trained by a small Army Special Forces contingent in Guatemala. The original plan had been to insert them into Cuba in paramilitary teams of 6 to 8 men to work with Cuban resistance groups. Beyond that, he have offered the opinion that a much larger force could be put inshore in Cuba to possibly hold the beachhead long enough for the U.S. to recognize a provisional opposition government and begin to openly aid it with American military support. The remarks from Dulles fail to detail the extent to which the CIA had already moved forward on just such preparation for an amphibious landing, without any specific presidential directive or formal modification of the official Cuba Project mission's description. Dulles also failed to describe the CIA's ongoing foreign relations contacts and negotiations, many of which were vital to the plan being currently operationally affected. Negotiations with foreign leaders were normally outside the CIA's province, so far from its normal role that the CIA's historian devoted a full section, Volume 2, Foreign Policy, to it in his study of the Cuba Project. Given the need for an air base close enough to support extended combat strikes into Cuba, project officers had begun working towards a Nicaraguan base as early as October 1960. Their groundwork went so far as to identify 2 American companies operating there as potential covers for the clandestine effort: Nicaraguan Longleaf Pine and Standard Fruit Company. CIA foreign policy efforts and diplomatic activities with Nicaragua were also notable because they were largely conducted by a CIA contract employee, William Rip Robertson. Robertson had served as a paramilitary officer in the earlier Guatemala project, coordinating military activities staged out of Nicaragua directly with Luis Somoza, the president of that nation. Afterwards, he operated a private business in Nicaragua for a number of years. In August 1960, he had written the CIA that his business, gold mining and water wells, in Nicaragua was closing and that he was in search of employment. Based on his experience and personal connections, he was given the responsibility of serving as the primary American government liaison to Somoza, effectively becoming the senior Cuba project in Nicaragua. He was ordered to that position only on December 2nd, 1960. As with the Guatemala ground force training bases, the Nicaraguan airstrike base, some 650 miles due west of Havana, also required substantial development. It was designated as JM Tide, and construction work on the facility actually began only in February 1961. The base would not become fully operational until early 1961, only weeks before the amphibious force was sent towards Cuba. From December and through March, all air operations over Cuba, primarily leafleting missions, continued to be flown from an air training base in Guatemala, JMAD. Apart from dropping propaganda and messages, some to specific groups, Those flights confirmed that the shipment of Soviet 37mm anti-aircraft guns had indeed begun to be emplaced in Cuba. As the propaganda leaflet drops increased early 1961, ground-based anti-aircraft fire became noticeably more common, even outside military targets. One C-54 transport was badly damaged by ground fire during this period, and clearly the air support resources for what was being proposed as effectively the second phase of the Cuba project did not exist, even as of December, when the idea was enthusiastically received by the outgoing special group. Nor did it actually exist at the very end of January, when President Kennedy was first briefed on the Cuba Volunteer Force and the new landing lodgment plan. However, as those discussions were literally just getting underway during January and early February, and before any review of CIA plans by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CIA teams were aggressively proceeding with a number of additional activities, including a major increase in maritime operations and the training of Cuban volunteers at several new facilities, including bases inside the United States. While these activities are mentioned in the official inquiries, details and timing are often lacking. Fortunately, we now know much more about them directly from the individuals involved and from CIA field operations documents. In terms of training, Cuban volunteers would be taking the Army's M41 tank into its first actual combat against the heavier Soviet tanks supplied to Cuba. The Cuban Brigade Tank Unit was being equipped with 5 of the M41 tanks and received their armor and tank training from the Army School at Fort Knox, Tennessee. Another special volunteer unit, Frogman and underwater demolitions, were taken first in late November into initial underwater training at a U.S. Marine reservation on an island off Puerto Rico. That group was then moved to a new facility for advanced training conducted at a former U.S. Navy location near Belle Chase, Louisiana, some 10 miles outside New Orleans. It remains unclear as to whether the special group specifically authorized each of these new American facilities for the Cuban project use. What is clear is that in December and January, many of the restrictions placed on the first phase of the Cuba project were no longer a consideration. The new Belle Chase base outside New Orleans stands out as particularly important, given that it was used to train a variety of maritime infiltrations personnel, including a special group to be deployed for a diversionary action during the amphibious landings. The facility itself had to be largely rebuilt from scratch under the direction of Grayson Lynch, a CIA paramilitary officer, who, along with Rip Robertson, would serve as the 2 officers participating in the actual amphibious landings at the Bay of Pigs. Lynch arrived at the Belle Chase camp in January 1961 to find it overgrown with bushes and trees. The base swimming pool, which was to be used for the underwater training, was clogged with algae. After several days of clearing and cleanup, actual weapons training began, both at Belle Chase and at an island some 6 miles out in the Gulf. By early February, Belle Chase was fully operational, and some 300 Cuban volunteers were in various types of training. At that point in time, Lynch was ordered to Key West to take over a vessel which had actually been purchased by the CIA from the United States Navy. That vessel was the Blagar, a surplus landing craft infantry boat. And the second LCI, the Barbara J, was already at a CIA Key West base under control of Rip Robertson. Those vessels would ultimately serve to insert the Frogman, an underwater demolitions team designated to reconnoiter and prepare for the landings. The 50 caliber machine guns, which Lynch and Robertson had mounted on the LCIs while at Key West, would prove to be the only significant air defense for the brigade ships and landing craft during the actual operations at the beachhead. At the time that the Cuban volunteers were going to the new types of training at American facilities, The CIA had yet to present its new military plans to the Joint Chiefs, and that became clear during President Kennedy's first meeting with his Joint Chiefs on January 25, 1961. The CIA did not attend that meeting, and when we asked the Pentagon participants about the Cuban situation, Kennedy was told that their opinion was that it was a clandestine approach. It was simply not going to work, as it would be necessary to put troops on the island. That would encourage guerrilla action, and the military would then directly support the revolutionary forces. The position of the chiefs in favor of overt American involvement was clear. It was also clear that the CIA had not reviewed its plans with the Joint Chief, and this was verified in the first CIA meeting with the new president on January 28, 1961. At that time, Director Dulles noted the Pentagon's view was no currently authorized action. That was the original Eisenhower-approved insurgency plan. And that was not going to be successful in ousting Castro, which was the CIA's current view. Senior CIA officers had been actively preparing an alternative course of action involving conventional military operation for over 2 months with no specific presidential authorization. In a late January meeting, President Kennedy did endorse the basic concept of preparing anti-Castro volunteers to be inserted into Cuba. He issued no new directive, but he did order the CIA to document its plan and review it with the Pentagon. Yet up to that point in time, the Cuba Project team had not been involved the military at all in its planning. In particular, it had not sought out Navy expertise in developing what was an increasingly complex, full-scale, conventional amphibious operation. However, some word of the CIA's preparations apparently filtered through the Eisenhower Special Group meetings. According to Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, the Joint Chiefs of Staff first heard of the amphibious landing proposal in January 1961. As Burke described it, the CIA initially made it adamantly clear that the operation was not a military one, and the military was not to be involved. But military leaders only became involved in February and March when President Kennedy directed the CIA to present their plan, which was designated as the Trinidad Plan, as it involved the landing at the Cuban city of Trinidad. This was to be briefed to the Joint Chiefs by the CIA per Kennedy's direction. Burke noted that there were few details in the Trinidad proposal, and it was largely a concept with very limited information on combat operations and logistics. So concrete evaluation of the plan was challenging for the Navy. This was a concern from the military perspective due to the lack of detail and open issues. He himself gave the plan no better than a 50% chance of success. He also noted that the follow-on plan, Zapata, was evaluated as having even less chance of success for a number of reasons, including the landings being closer to the Cuban Air Force's fields and it having been reworked to be more clandestine and less of a standard military operation. In contrast, the Joint Chiefs' February 3rd initial assessment of the Trinidad Plan, prepared after no more than 3 to 4 days of studies, was somewhat more encouraging. The plan was given a favorable evaluation, concluding that there was a fair chance of landing the volunteer force. However, the Chief's assessment noted that the plan assumed a virtually unopposed landing and that the supply logistics for the plan were austere. Resupply efforts would likely fail if any determined Cuban opposition appeared. In the event that no popular uprising occurred, without some local influx of local volunteers, the CIA was assuming an immediate 1,500 force, which would join the Cuban brigade landing. Any determined Cuban resistance would overwhelm the beachhead. A supplemental Joint Chiefs air study of the plan warned that the total suppression of the Cuban Air Force was absolutely mandatory. noting that if a single Cuban combat aircraft was operational over the beachhead, it would expose the supply ships and potentially doom the entire effort. The Joint Chiefs study provides us with a useful illustration and a caution in regard to how military issues, which are supremely important operationally, can essentially become buried behind the summaries of the projects and plans that serve as the main points of policy level discussion. In this instance, the critical issues with the CIA plan were covered in detail with the Joint Chiefs report, but not strongly reflected in the summary, which rated the plan as favorable. If the issues had been developed into a checklist to monitor the evolution of the plan and later real-time command of the operation, there's a strong chance that the operation would have canceled or that the landing force would have aborted following the evaluation of the initial airstrikes on Castro's Air Force. There is no doubt that command and control of the military elements of covert operation is especially challenging, and we will explore that point in detail in the following chapter. In terms of detail and reality, at the time of the early February plan assessment by the Joint Chiefs, both the maritime and air activities of the Cuba project were still far from being ready to support an immediate operation, certainly not one which would have met Hawkins' original March 1 deadline. A new cadre of American military trainers was only then beginning to appearing in Guatemala in late January, early February, and the specialty tank, parachute, and underwater team training was still in progress. Construction at the new airstrike base in Guatemala and the Bell Chase camp in Louisiana was only just underway in February. And there was no CIA maritime element operational other than the group of CIA personnel in Miami and the Florida Keys engaged in running clandestine small boat infiltration, exfiltration, and minor supply missions into Cuba. Missions which had been extremely limited up to that point in time. However, well before the Navy had been notified of the amphibious operation, and months before the Joint Chiefs performed their evaluation of the Trinidad plan, sea officers had already attempted to obtain military vessels by verbally requisitioning the Navy for its use. 2 CIA officers appeared at the Little Creek office of the Atlantic Amphibious Command and expressed the need for a large amphibious assault ship. When questioned as to their need, they refused to provide details, simply saying that the president had personally endorsed the request. The commander declined, instead calling the Joint Chief and expressing outrage over such a demand. In the end, Cuba Project Chief Bissell personally intervened, and the Navy did sell 3 landing craft to the CIA for $125,000 each. However, the CIA found the craft to be virtually inoperable, and CIA's personnel spent the winter months making them seaworthy enough to sail from Hampton Roads to Puerto Rico. Later, the naval officer detailed of the project discovered that the CIA employees initially assigned to move the LCIs had little and no experience with them, and offered the opinion that was fortunate that the LCIs had even made it across the Caribbean to Puerto Rico. As much as the Cuba Project team might like to proceed entirely on its own, the scale of the amphibious operation being developed had evolved into something which could not be carried out with the Navy assistance, and without specialized military craft of the size and capability for transporting tanks as well as infantry landing craft. And of course, in terms of deniability, the transport and landing of tanks, trucks, and heavy weapons was something far beyond the CIA could conceivably have managed on its own. In itself, the appearance of multiple infantry and tank landing craft unloading large military trucks, tanks, and huge quantity of weapons and ammunition at the Bay of Pigs clearly would demonstrate American government sponsorship. This was obviously a primary reason why President Kennedy became so consistently adamant that the entire landing operation had to be conducted totally at night, with all craft involved withdrawing well off the beachhead into the ocean during daylight hours. The Navy vessel assigned for the heavy transport duty was the landing dock craft San Marcos, stationed at Little Creek near Hampton Roads, Virginia. The World War II era San Marcos had been built in 1944 and was covertly deployed by the Navy to Puerto Rico, where it was ultimately loaded with M41 tanks, trucks, machine guns, and ammunitions. The San Marcos also carried special utility landing craft capable of transmitting cargo to and from other vessels or directly to the beaches. The landing ship, a large and specially equipped vessel, was operated by regular Navy personnel, and its crew, as well as the crews of a number of destroyers and an aircraft carrier, were obviously going to be well aware of the extent to which the four Cubans' landings were being directly supported by the American military. For that matter, the officers and crews of the actual landing craft with the CIA case officers, which would go directly into Cuban waters to support the landings, included engineers, radio operators, and mates, all of whom were Americans on loan to the CIA from the Military Sea Transportation Service. They were experienced civilian mariners, but definitely not combat officers. While the CIA officers sailing with each landing craft were combat experienced, they themselves were not in charge of the vessels. That command remained entirely with the civilian captains of the LCIs. Acting on its own initiatives, the CIA has also arranged for additional transport ships, including the freighter, now designated as a troop carrier, Rio Escondido, and 3 Cuban-registered ships, all with Cuban crews. Those 3 ships were essentially loaned to the project by one of the owners of the Garcia line, Eduardo Garcia, which operated out of Havana. The arrangements for creating the ships spoke against any reasonable expectation for the long-term deniability of U.S. involvement in the landings. The ships were effectively taken over by the CIA while in American ports, with all pro-Castro seamen removed and detained by U.S. immigration. The ships were then sailed to Nicaragua, and Garcia himself visited each in turn, explaining that they would be involved in an action against Castro. Anyone declining to participate, as did one captain and 5 crew members, were detained in Nicaragua. The 3 Cuban freighters were designated to carry the force's troops, weapons, and ammunition. However, neither the ship's captains nor crews were experienced or prepared for what turned into an extremely dangerous combat mission. That lack of experience and commitment became tragically apparent during the actual landings when 2 of the transports fled the area of the landing and failed to return to deliver desperately needed ammunition. One ship had to be stopped in flight by American destroyers some 200 miles south of Cuba, and the other ship was only discovered and returned following an aerial search by aircraft from the Navy aircraft carrier supporting the operation. The extent of the maritime support required for the amphibious operation, the size and quantity of the vessels involved, the number of Americans, both military and civilian, actually supporting, participating, and the involvement of the Cuban crews who had not volunteered for combat all clearly exposed the amphibious operation in terms of long-term deniability. Yet for some reason, none of these elements appeared to have been of serious concern during the February-March discussions of the plan. Even the landing of American Army tanks on the beaches appeared not to have emerged as an issue. Throughout the debate over the operation, and even during the final landings, the only real concern was exposure of American involvement as it related to airstrikes on Cuban targets and combat air cover for the landings. As of February 18th, The new president, President Kennedy, had not been at all convinced that a massive amphibious operation was a correct approach to the problem of Fidel Castro, despite all the operations and preparations which were underway for just that. As of that date, Kennedy was still looking at options and dealing with contending agendas, including anti-Castro political conditions, including an anti-Castro political coalition, and ranging to the mass infiltration of Cuban volunteers. President Kennedy had still made no definite decision to commit to the amphibious landing and enlargement operation, and the CIA was quite well aware of that fact. However, the Joint Chiefs had given a qualified endorsement. All of the plans were in place. The Navy had come on board, assigning a single amphibious operations specialist to the project. And during 1961, U.S. Navy Captain Jack Scapa detailed the task force from the Atlantic Fleet's Amphibious Training Command, served as the special assistant for military matters. Scapa became personally involved in the maritime aspects of the amphibious landing, first in regard to the initial CIA plan, Trinidad, and later as liaison for the actual U.S. Navy support the final landing operation, Plan Zapata, the Bay of Pigs. His first-hand comments on the naval involvement and the evolution of the operation of the operational plans, including the Navy's rules of engagement, are of considerable interest and come from his extended interview with the Daybook, a publication of the Hampton Roads Naval Museum. Scapa's observations were also quite useful in appreciating how the first CIA proposal, Trinidad, compared to the final plan, Zapata, and how the initial Navy rules of engagement would have very likely led to almost immediate combat between the U.S. Navy and Cuban forces. Scapa's remarks also describe a Navy element of the amphibious plans totally missing from all the official inquiries after the disaster at the Bay of Pigs. That involved preparations made to enable American jet fighter bomber strikes across the island of Cuba. We will explore that and the apparent lack of any contingency plans for removing and relanding the force, per President Kennedy's direction, as well as certain CIA activities which the President was not briefed on in a following chapter.